B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Friday, February 21st, 2020. And just as I got ready to record today's podcast, the news broke that Mike Bloomberg has done an about-face. Notch another victory in the belt of Elizabeth Warren. For people who watched or have read coverage of the smackdown in Las Vegas on Wednesday night, Elizabeth Warren came out with guns blazing, whatever phrase or metaphor you want to use, and her major target was Mike Bloomberg. She also took potshots at every other candidate on the stage. And Bloomberg rebuffed her arguments that he should release women who signed non-disclosure agreements after sexual harassment claims that they made while working for Mike Bloomberg. And today, the former New York mayor and billionaire said that after a lot of reflecting, well, gosh, Mike, it was only 2 days, that he will no longer offer confidential agreements to resolve sexual misconduct claims, and he will permit his company to release women who've accused him of sexual harassment from non-disclosure agreements in 3 cases. Now, there's no outside review here to determine if these are the 3 cases where nothing really transpired. We have no way of knowing the full universe of claims that have been made against Bloomberg. And this is a good point to bring up, that when Bloomberg was mayor of New York, he continued to run his business empire. He said that he stepped away from the day-to-day functions, but there was no blind trust or any other effort to insulate him from his business. So today he issued a statement. I recognize that NDAs, particularly when they're used in the context of sexual harassment and sexual assault, promote a culture of silence in the workplace and contribute to a culture of women not feeling safe or supported. He said that his company has identified 3 NDAs that this would pertain to, and that if those women would like to speak, they may ask for a release. So Warren didn't let this go after challenging him in the debate. Yesterday, she said, I used to teach contract law, and I thought I'd make this easy. I wrote up a release and a covenant not to sue. And all that Mayor Bloomberg has to do is download it, I'll text it, sign it, and then the women or men will be free to speak and tell their own stories. None of them accused me of doing anything other than maybe they didn't like a joke I told. That was Bloomberg's explanation on Wednesday night. And I suppose at least in these 3 cases, we'll find out if one of his jokes was the cause of the discomfort of the women who complained. And one of the best-known comments he made was he unveiled one of his new terminals. And he said that it could do everything that a human could, including giving a blowjob. Ha, ha, ha. So he has a history of off-color comments, and maybe we're going to get some verbatims of new ones that we haven't heard about before. So today, the Bloomberg campaign is being hit for the release of a selectively edited video. And this isn't quite the James O'Keefe type, but they issued a video that had been spliced from the debate where Bloomberg did so badly on Wednesday night. And what they did was take a comment that he had made that I believe that I'm the only one here who's ever started a business. And they inserted additional silence. There was a kind of a hush when Bloomberg said that, and nobody stepped forward and said, well, I had an Amway business. And so what they did was they extended the silence, and then they added some crickets. Now, the campaign says, hey, everybody knows there were no crickets at the Vegas debate. But this is an indication of the spin control that Bloomberg will exercise, and he runs a media empire, and I'm sure he's got a lot of guys and gals who believe in him, who will selectively edit his performances to make them look good to the paid media that Bloomberg is pushing out on a daily basis. And the spending, we're told now, has exceeded $460 million in just 90 days. That guy is really blowing through a wad of cash on a very risky bet. But of course, he says that the risk is that if we nominate a tragic guy like Bernie Sanders, that Trump will get another 4-year term. Will voters buy that? That's the gamble that is on the table right now. We'll just have to see how it all plays out. Interesting story from BuzzFeed. They tracked down the Democratic candidate who challenged Peter King in the New York suburbs in 2018. Her name is Liuba Gretchen Shirley. She came very close to defeating King. She says the critical difference was a billionaire named Mike Bloomberg jumped in and donated a lot of cash to support Peter King, and he came within 5% of losing his seat after 26 years in office. Bloomberg said, well, Peter King's a longtime friend. But remember, on the debate stage Wednesday, he was taking credit for the $300 million that he spent supporting Democratic candidates, sponsored by Nancy Pelosi, in 2018. But somehow, despite his effort to support a Democratic majority, he felt that Peter King was the exception. He's also being dinged for nearly $12 million in spending in support of Republican Senator Pat Toomey back in 2016. And this was a gambit because Bloomberg felt that Toomey was a moderate Republican on gun legislation and wanted to keep him in the Senate. But as people point out in hindsight, there were 2 Senate seats we needed to pick up then. He ensured that Republicans stayed in power because of that. And that's a comment from the woman who lost to Pete King, Gretchen Shirley. So he has a very checkered record on who he supports politically, and it shows that his primary value is self-interest. Who can I get access to? Who can I get favors from? Not too different from the comments Trump was making at about this time in 2016. Now, in reaction to the power politics, the insurgent Democrat from Long Island, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, has endorsed an all-female slate of progressive candidates through her new political action committee. And I am really proud of what she is doing here, because instead of her giving her money to the Democratic Campaign Congressional Committee, the DCCC, which only supports incumbents, Ocasio-Cortez is really, in my view, trying to pave the way so that Bernie has some progressive coattails. Because one of the complaints we're hearing is that, well, you know, if Sanders runs, it's bad for the down ticket. The Senate will remain Republican, and who knows what will happen with the House. Well, part of the problem is in the recruitment of candidates. The Democrats keep choosing self-funding rich guys and former Republicans. And AOC said one of our primary goals is to reward political courage in Congress and to help elect a progressive majority in the House of Representatives. There's a kind of dual nature to this. One is opening the door to newcomers. The other is to reward members of Congress who are exhibiting very large amounts of political courage. So who's on her list? Well, she's bucking the Senate leadership by supporting Cristina Sinsun Ramirez, a labor and voting rights activist, running against the Democrats' hand-picked opponent for John Cornyn, the Republican incumbent in Texas. And that's M.J. Hagar, a relatively conservative Democrat. Then we have 3 candidates, Teresa Leger Fernandez in New Mexico, Samalis Lopez, and Georgette Gomez in California, they're running for open seats in Democratic districts. And Gomez has been endorsed by Bernie Sanders. And in another case, Kara Eastman is challenging the Republican in Nebraska, Don Bacon, for a second time. Ocasio-Cortez is also supporting Marie Newman, the challenger to Conservadem Daniel Lipinski in Illinois, and Jessica Cisneros, who is trying to defeat barely Democratic Congressman Henry Cuellar of Texas. So to me, this is exciting. This is the kind of action and activism that I like to see. And it's what produces long-term change. 60 Minutes has scored an interview with Bernie Sanders. You'll see it Sunday night. They decided after the debate in Las Vegas that he is the man of the moment. Now, they put up Anderson Cooper. I don't know why they allow him to work for CBS and for CNN. There's too much Anderson Cooper for my taste out there. At any rate, in the preview clip, the teaser clip that CBS released today, they asked Sanders about whether or not he was surprised by Bloomberg's weak performance. And in Cooper's question, his struggles to answer some basic, obvious questions. And Sanders said, well, yes, he did struggle. And if that's what happened in a Democratic debate, I think it's quite likely that Trump will chew him up and spit him out. He went on to say, I'm worried about an unprecedented amount of money being spent on a campaign. And, we've never seen anything like this in American history. And I just think, though, that the American people will rebel against this type of oligarchic movement. We're a democracy, one person, one vote, not a guy worth $60 billion buying an election. And I think that that clear contrast really resonates with voters. And I think net-net, Bloomberg is going to help cement support for Bernie Sanders. Some interesting commentary in today's New York Times, the Friday edition. David Brooks, who is a moderate Republican, old-school Bush style, he makes some good points here. He says successful presidential candidates are myth makers. They don't just tell a story. They tell one that helps people make meaning out of the current moment, that divides people into heroes and villains, that names a central challenge and explains why they are the perfect person to meet it. And he says that Trump did this in 2016 and that Bernie Sanders is also telling a successful myth. Corporate and Wall Street elites are rapacious monsters who hoard the nation's wealth and oppress working families. It's not an original myth, says Brooks, either. It's been around since the class conflict agitators of 1848. And he says when you're inside the Sanders myth, you see the world through the Bernie lens. And in that case, when you look at Mike Bloomberg, you see a rapacious billionaire who amassed a gross amount of wealth, who became an authoritarian mayor, targeted young black men, and then tried to buy his way to power. So I think it's a strong analysis that he offers. I'll put up a link to it in the show file for the podcast, and you can explore it yourself. Also, Paul Krugman in today's Times is saying that the Democrats should give up on Medicare for all. He is just dissing it, saying it's not going to be enacted no matter who wins. And I agree it's a heavy lift, but I don't think it is out of the question. In any event, I agree with his alternate advice, which is that the Democrats focusing on Wall Street and the debacle caused by financial deregulation. And I think there is some good advice there, at least on the Wall Street angle. Also, Frank Bruni has an interesting commentary in today's New York Times, headlined, Why Democrats Are Bound for Disaster. And he does make the case that it's plausible that we're going to have a contested or brokered convention. And he cites the last question that was asked in the debate, should the politician with the plurality of delegates be the nominee? And only Sanders says that, and it's opportunist on his part. I acknowledge that. But he's hoping to avoid that second ballot where the superdelegates would deal him out. And Bruni says, something unsettling is going on in American politics, in America, period, and the chaotic Democratic race exemplifies it. The rules are all blurry, the processes are suspect, or at least they're seen that way. More and more judgments are up for debate, more and more defeats are prone to dispute. Trump is a prime player. He's exploiting and accelerating a crisis of faith in traditions and institutions, not causing it. He's improvising, and he's hardly alone. And this is similar to a comment I shared with Adam Eichen in our in-depth interview podcast that we published earlier this week. And I referred to it as exploiting the disequilibrium in the American political stew today. And it does leave people suspicious. Bernie supporters have legitimate suspicions that the DNC is trying to stop him, that powerful influences are colluding to block his ascent to the nomination, and to continually describe him as a guy who cannot win in November. And the data is clear that he can. But the New York Times opinion page today, the editorial page writers gave it over to a signed editorial by Michelle Cottle, who has revealed herself as a virulent anti-Sanders opinion maker. And she revisits the hits that were placed against Bernie in the debate the other night about his health and transparency about it, about the Bernie bros, and tries to turn it into, a kind of unvarnishing of Bernie Sanders. But I don't think his followers are reading the New York Times opinion page. And once again, I think that the criticism tends to harden support for Sanders. Yesterday, I went into San Francisco in the afternoon and spent an hour with Mark Halperin. Now, Mark used to be ABC Television's lead political director. He worked at MSNBC. He had a show on the Bloomberg network. And in 2016, he and John Heilemann and Mark McKinnon co-hosted the Showtime Circus, where they traveled the country following the campaigns. And as you may know, Mark Halperin suffered from a Me Too episode. And he's basically trying to rebuild a career that was derailed by that. And we have a frank conversation about that toward the end of the interview. But we had a really good, respectful exchange going back and forth. He's a mainstream guy with access to a lot of mainstream thinkers. And we challenged each other. And in this exchange, in the preview clip I'm going to play for you right now, Mark Halperin asked me if I thought Nancy Pelosi was captive to corporate interests. Is she a corporate tool? And I said, unfortunately, I think she is. Here is that exchange.
Do you think Nancy Pelosi is controlled by corporate interests? She takes a lot of money from rich people and from people associated with corporations. Do you think she's...
Well, her majority is fueled by $300 million that came from Mike Bloomberg.
I understand, but do you think when she makes decisions about what legislation to support, what legislation to put on the floor, do you think that she is a tool of corporate America?
I'm afraid, and let me explain that I've known Pelosi since she went to Congress. I worked as a campaign advisor for her during one cycle back in the 1990s. I have the highest respect for her, but in the leadership position, she has shifted quite a bit. And yes, I do believe she is unduly influenced by corporate money and by the people who she travels with and rubs elbows with.
Yeah, I mean, I think she's definitely influenced by it, but I don't think it motivates her primary decisions. I really do think that to support the Green New Deal is not because corporations don't like it. I think and energy companies don't like it. I think she doesn't support it because she doesn't think that traffic will bear some of the implications of it in terms of regulation and jobs and taxes. So if the country were as liberal as Bernie Sanders is, now tens of millions of people in the country are as liberal as Bernie Sanders and love his agenda. And I have been probably amongst people in the so-called mainstream media, I have been a strong supporter of, or a strong opponent of people in the press decrying him as a crazy old socialist. He speaks to the aspirations of tens of millions of Americans, their frustrations, their fears, and their aspirations. But I don't think those positions, and I don't think Nancy Pelosi thinks those positions are majority positions right now. Now, I have a huge amount of respect for him because I know he knows that in some ways, and that he thinks his responsibility, as you suggested before, is to raise these issues, say this is the right thing, and to try to build greater support for it. I think that's great, but I don't think that everyone who opposes his agenda in the Democratic Party opposes it because they're in the pocket of special interests and corporate interests and labor unions. I think some of them don't oppose it because they don't think it can pass. Some of them don't think it should pass. And some of them think it will ruin the brand of the Democratic Party. And that is the majority view of, that's what Barack Obama thinks, Nancy Pelosi thinks, Chuck Schumer thinks, Kamala Harris thinks. And that, you can't discount that. You can't say that that's meaningless, particularly if your aspiration above all else in the next year is to beat Donald Trump.
That's Mark Halperin, the former ABC News political analyst, and we had a great conversation. I think it's important for progressives to understand the thinking in the mainstream, and Halperin did a good job of acknowledging the benefits of a Bernie Sanders campaign, his positives, and also brought forward the reservations of many mainstream Democrats who are concerned that he is moving the party too far left. And so I think that progressives need to hear this and understand it as we try to prevail in a very difficult political season. And as mentioned, Halperin was quite forthcoming as I asked him about the episode where he was accused by former female co-workers of inappropriate advances and, in some cases, inappropriate kissing or other personal contact. To my knowledge, Mark Halperin was never accused of any sort of rape or other sex crime, but he nevertheless has paid a price for it. He lost his gig at MSNBC at Showtime. A book deal was canceled. And I hope you'll listen to the full conversation because he talks about his openness to restorative justice, which I think is necessary in the murky world of accusations that are never really proven and punishments that are meted out mob style, not based on any fairness about, the severity of the crime and the respective punishment. Now, speaking of this, Halperin, in many video reports, is lumped in with Harvey Weinstein and Bill Cosby as a sexual predator. And again, to my knowledge, he does not rise or descend, if you will, to that level. We are learning that the jury in the Weinstein sexual assault trial in New York has told the judge that it is hung up on 2 of the top counts, but unanimous, apparently for conviction, on the other charges. So the judge talked to them for a while, sent them home for the weekend, told them to come back Monday and to continue their deliberations. But a note they sent to the judge indicates that there is not unanimity on counts of predatory sexual assault. And so the jury is asking, can we be deadlocked on some charges and unanimous on others? So we'll see how that plays out in the coming week or so. Every day I like to pause for a second to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. People like Ben Brotman, Pat Gray, Carla Mahoney, and our good buddy Jason Ferguson. You can join them. All you have to do is visit peterbcollins.com, find the menu tab, click on Become a Subscriber. You'll hit the sign-up page, and bingo, you can set up the subscription that fits your budget. Now, if you don't like PayPal, and I understand that, you can send your contributions and any other correspondence to my P.O. Box, number 150-660, San Rafael, California, zip code 94915. Now, today in Iran, they're conducting parliamentary elections, and this is no way a democracy. But it's interesting to see the New York Times coverage. They note that the clerical leadership, the mullahs, have disqualified more than 7,000 candidates running in the parliamentary elections. And we're supposed to see this as just another dastardly angle of the so-called regime in Iran. But we hardly have any status to give people lectures, lessons, or criticism on how we conduct our elections. And Dick Atlee, a listener with a sense of humor, he lives in Maine, he forwarded to me an email from the Fordham Law School. The Trump administration announced new sanctions Thursday against 5 Iranian election officials who disqualified thousands of moderate candidates from running in today's parliamentary vote. And then his bracketed comment, Dick Atlee, somehow reminiscent of certain Republican secretaries of state in a familiar country working on the other end of the election, the voters rather than the contenders. Then the press release continues. Tomorrow, the Iranian regime, that's the loaded word, will stage an event euphemistically called elections, said Brian Hook of the State Department. Unfortunately, the real election took place in secret long before any ballots were cast. Attlee's snarky rejoinder, For a minute I lost track of the country involved and thought they were talking about the DNC or the larger picture in those notorious selections they have in the U.S. You get the idea. Meanwhile, we are told that we're very close to a deal with the Taliban that could lead to withdrawal of some of the roughly 15,000 U.S. troops in Afghanistan today. But this is such a wobbly deal. Mike Pompeo is claiming that if the Taliban observes a nationwide reduction in violence for 7 days, starting at midnight tonight, then the U.S. will move forward and sign an agreement with the Taliban on Leap Year Day, the 29th of February. But all of this is speculative because a deal between the U.S. and the Taliban still leaves out the government that is in place that we have installed in Kabul. And we still have a dispute over the election between Ashraf Ghani, the incumbent, who claims he won, and Abdullah, who claims the election was fraudulent. And we know there aren't clean elections in Afghanistan. The last time Obama said, well, you know, the election was consistent with democratic values. But all of these discussions have excluded the Afghan government. And I don't think you can have a substantial peace agreement without their buy-in. Okay, the alarm has been sounded again. Rachel Maddow was flashing red lights last night because another murky assessment from the intelligence community that Russia is trying to meddle in the 2020 elections in favor of Trump was presented a week ago to the Intelligence Committee of the House. The briefing came from a high-ranking official in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, a woman named Shelby Pearson. And while offering no evidence of what kind of interference, whether it's on Facebook and efforts to disrupt election counting, there are no details to this claim. And it has enraged Donald Trump. So he's fired the acting director of national intelligence. All these people are just temporary, so Trump can manipulate them and then boot them out when he has a little tantrum. But I have to say that while I do not defend or support Trump in any way, that he's got to be a little sensitive. Because the bogus intelligence assessment of January 2017 that was then embraced as evidence by Bob Mueller in his limited hangout report, well, if I were in Trump's shoes, I'd be uncomfortable too. But we don't know the details here. And I guess we're all just supposed to quiver in the corner and worry about what Russia might do. But when you look again at what we're doing to each other, how could Russia do any better in dividing the American public and having Democrats squabble through the primary? I'm sorry, I can't find a compelling case of how Russia could do any better than we do to ourselves. So there is legitimate criticism. Trump has plugged in, we're told, a very short term, his loyal ambassador to Germany, a dunderhead named Richard Grenell. He has no experience with intelligence, and it's unclear what he will do. He says he's only going to be there for a few weeks, and Trump says he has some dynamite people he wants to consider for Director of National Intelligence. He mentioned Doug Collins of Georgia, who said, never mind, I'm trying to get this Senate seat, Don. Leave me alone. But our dear tweeter, expressing his dissatisfaction, claims that this Republican appointee presenting information to the Intelligence Committee about an alleged scheme by Russia to meddle in the elections is, quote, another misinformation campaign being launched by Democrats in Congress. Well, I can't process this. It just leads to a brain freeze. So Trump has kept tweeting about the Justice Department, But Bill Barr is described as comforted that Trump has stopped attacking Judge Amy Berman Jackson as he continues his stout defense of Roger Stone and the gross injustice that has been visited on Trump's lying son of a bitch. And I just love this, that Mr. Barr has come to recognize that he may never be able to keep Trump quiet altogether, and so in parsing the president's latest comments, the Attorney General and his team chose to see them as progress and an opportunity to work out their differences without further public exchange. I haven't listened to it yet, but I'm intrigued by the details of the latest podcast by my colleague Jeff Schechtman over at whowhatwhy.org. And he interviews a guy from Iowa, a talk radio host named Jeff Stein, who has covered 11 Iowa caucuses during his career. And they describe it as a discussion of the clusterfuck that led to no results on election night and still no clear outcome of the Iowa caucuses. A new poll from the Pew Research Center shows that, in general, Americans are deeply concerned about climate change, but it appears to be top-heavy with Democrats. 78% of Democrats call it a top policy priority in 2020, but less than 25% of Republicans do. Now, that disinformation campaign didn't come from Moscow, from Putin, from Russia, from the GRU. It came from American carbon extractors, the money that they donate to political campaigns, and the willful ignorance of Donald Trump and his followers, who do not want to see any human cause in our obviously changing climate. A couple of quick mentions about yellow journalism. I was deeply offended by a report I watched last night on the PBS NewsHour from Venezuela. It was so biased. It only quoted one supporter of Maduro for a brief segment. The rest of it was all devoted to people who complain about the problems in Venezuela and support Juan Guaido, the self-promoting would-be president. There was no mention in the entire report of U.S. sanctions contributing to, compounding the economic problems in Venezuela. It's all blamed on socialism and Chavismo. And they didn't even bother to mention in their recitation of recent history that Chavez was the victim of a Bush-backed coup in 2003 that took him out of office for 48 hours before he was restored. No, that's inconvenient to their narrative. And more yellow journalism, and it's something I expect from the HuffPost. But they do a follow-up on Dana Rohrabacher, the former Republican congressman who said that he told Julian Assange that he'd get Trump to pardon Assange if he had accurate information proving that Russians had not been the source for the DNC leaks that were published by WikiLeaks. And listen to this. Rohrabacher said his goal during the meeting was to find proof for a widely debunked conspiracy theory that WikiLeaks' real source for the DNC emails was not Russian intelligence, but former DNC staffer Seth Rich, murdered on the streets of Washington in July 2016. Now, it has never been debunked. There is no evidence of who killed Seth Rich. There's no conclusive investigation. And so it's an open question about whether Seth Rich was the source, about whether the flash drive that Craig Murray carried from Washington to Assange in London in July of 2016 was the source. But when they report widely debunked conspiracy theories, those are things that we're not supposed to believe because it doesn't match the official narrative. Couple of quick stories here before I wrap up for the day and for this week. New York's Attorney General is accusing New York City of committing fraud by inflating the value of yellow taxi medallions and is demanding $810 million from the city to compensate the thousands of drivers who are now saddled with enormous debt. And it's really interesting because a month or two ago, I posted something on Facebook sympathetic to taxi drivers who have had the value of their medallions turned into almost zero because of Uber and Lyft. and I suggested that they should get some shares in Uber and Lyft as some sort of compensation. And I couldn't believe how many lefties piled on and said, oh, cab drivers suck. They don't care about the issue of fairness to them and the way they were hoodwinked into buying these medallions, as the same entities failed to regulate these rogue operators, Uber and Lyft, who have destroyed the regulated taxi industries in most cities. And San Francisco is facing a similar issue where the authority that issued these medallions to taxi drivers said that there were some guarantees to them. And there's now litigation to see if the city will compensate those drivers. More thuggish behavior by the Trump administration leaning on New York City and New York State. We know that they have blocked New Yorkers from using the, what is it called? The system where you pass through the airport because you've already submitted to some sort of security scrutiny. Well, the latest gambit, punishing New York because they have issued driver's licenses to undocumented immigrants, is that the Homeland Security Department is blocking the export of used cars. Now, there's a pretty brisk trade in used cars shipped from New York to the Caribbean and to South America. And now they're using a technicality, saying that they're putting a hold on any vehicles that were licensed or registered in New York. It's thuggish payback, and it reminds me of Chris Christie's Bridgegate scandal. And finally today, two reports from California's Central Valley, the breadbasket of America. The Washington Post found support for Mike Bloomberg in Stockton, California. Stockton, a city that just came out of bankruptcy, is not a wealthy town. But its mayor has received campaign contributions from Mike Bloomberg and has endorsed him. So we have one of the examples, Lynn Silva, retired special education instructor, lifelong Democrat, 66 years old. She said that she's starting to conclude that Bloomberg, hardly her first choice, may be the ultimate candidate for a coldly calculated reason, because he has the money to win. And this shows, I'm sorry to insult Ms. Silva, but ignorant, low-information voters who believe that money is the only way you win a political campaign. I've cited that Hillary outspent Trump 3-1 in 2016, and that Bloomberg's negative ads about Trump will not change the mind of a substantial number of Trump supporters. So money alone can't turn this around. And the second story in the New York Times comes from tiny McFarland, California. Population 15,000. More than half of the residents are undocumented farm workers. And the city is reeling because the state of California has outlawed private prisons. And the Geo Group, which owns 2 lockups near McFarland and was paying $1.5 million a year in taxes to the town, well, they've been told they can't house California prisoners there, so they're trying to lease these facilities to ICE, to the federal government. And the residents said no. The mayor, Manuel Cantu, is frustrated. He said, without the Geo Group, we can't guarantee we can pay for law enforcement, fire, or any other services. He announced his resignation as mayor, predicted that closure of the prisons will be devastating to the city, which already has a $500,000 deficit. But he said, if the residents don't want them because of their fear of ICE or whatever, the city belongs to the residents. That is a rare, enlightened view of an elected official. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment. You're free to share it all over the place. You'll find it on YouTube. And I remain Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.